Hello and welcome to the Daily Aus. I'm Lucy Tassell.
I'm Billi FitzSimons.
The World Court has handed down a landmark decision finding countries could be required to pay compensation to other nations affected by their climate harms. It's the result of a historic case initiated by a group of law students from Pacific Island nations which face risks from rising seas. In today's episode, we'll explain the lead up to this decision, what the World Court is, and what it might mean for countries around the world.
So Lucy, there is so much to unpack here.
Yeah.
But I want to start by explaining what the World Court is. So it's officially called the International Court of Justice.
Yeah.
For anyone who's not familiar with it, what is it?
Yeah, so the ICJ is one of the main bodies of the United Nations. You know how we think of the United Nations as having agencies.
Yep.
It also has the General Assembly, which is, if you ever did Model UN, that's what you're mimicking.
Yep.
One of its bodies is the ICJ. It's also known as the World Court, as I said. It basically decides on disputes between two different countries that can come to it with an issue. It can also decide on legal issues brought to it by the UN. So the UN General Assembly can vote and say, we need a resolution on this kind of legal issue that might not necessarily be between two opposing countries, but we need advice. It has 15 judges and it hands down its decisions in The Hague in the Netherlands. Its rulings are typically binding, but it's hard to enforce them, as it is with any kind of dispute between two nations. And then I should also say it's different to the ICC, or the International Criminal Court. So that court oversees trials of individuals who are accused of crimes against civilians during wars, things like genocide, torture, sexual violence, and it steps in when those individuals' countries are, quote, unable or unwilling to take them to trial. So you've got the World Court, which is between countries or deciding on issues that affect the whole world. And then you've got the ICC, which is about people.
Got it. And we're talking about the ICJ, like you said, that's called the World Court, and it's basically considered the world's top court.
Yes.
And so the reason we're talking about it today is because they have handed down this big decision on countries' climate responsibilities. How did this case come to the court in the first place?
Well, I think it has really interesting origins. So it starts in 2019 with a group of law students at the University of the South Pacific. They started a campaign called Pacific Island Students Fighting Climate Change. Oh, that's actually not a good acronym. PISFFCC. Never mind. Pacific Island Students Fighting Climate Change. We'll just say the students for clarity.
Yes.
Their aim was to have the ICJ hand down a legal opinion about countries' climate change obligations, which has now succeeded all these years down the line. So these students are from some of the countries that are facing an immediate risk from climate change impacts, I would say particularly rising sea levels. We can understand kind of intellectually what happens when the sea rises and you live on a small island. In August 2022, Vanuatu brought the students' campaign to a meeting of leaders of Pacific countries, that includes Australia, and those countries' leaders agreed to take the students' request to the UN. In 2023, the UN General Assembly voted on this being taken to the ICJ, so it's a lot of procedural steps, and the UN agreed this should be sent to the ICJ to consider. So it's Vanuatu bringing it on the students' behalf because, as I said, it's the World Court, a country has to be involved, but then it ends up being this kind of legal decision function of the court rather than a court case. Although, as I'll explain, we could see a court case in the future.
Right. It's quite a cool story that this all came from university students and that the UN took them so seriously.
It's maybe the most successful group project of all time.
Yeah. It's a great way to look at it. And so then what were they asking the ICJ to consider?
It's all wrapped up in a lot of legalese, and so I think it can be boiled down to two main questions. The first question is, what does international law require countries to do to protect the environment from human-caused climate change? Human-caused climate change is also sometimes called anthropogenic. And then the second question is, if countries are found to, quote, have caused significant harm to the climate system, negatively impacting particularly small island nations and also future generations, what should the consequences be? I mean, you can't send a country to jail. So what can we say should be the consequence?
I'm always fascinated by this area of international law because as you kind of touched on at the start, it's really hard to enforce that because the world doesn't have one global set of legislation that we all agree on.
Yeah.
What we do have, though, in this space is the Paris Agreement. So when we talk about international law when it comes to climate change, is that what we're talking about, the Paris Agreement?
Yeah, that's a big part of it. It's not the only one, but I would say it's kind of the big boy. It's the main piece of climate it's a binding agreement is what I should say. So it's legally binding, and countries that are party to it, so they've signed it, they agree to abide by its terms, have a requirement to limit their carbon emissions and their pollution. They've committed to cutting their emissions with the intention of limiting global average temperature increases to 1.5 degrees Celsius above the levels that they were at before the Industrial Revolution, the cause of all the things that go into the atmosphere. I will say the agreement, if you're party to the agreement, it's legally binding. You don't have to continue being a party to the agreement. As we've seen with the Trump administration twice over, has pulled the US out of the Paris Agreement. So the US enters under Obama, is pulled out under Trump, re-enters under Biden, is now being re-pulled out again by Trump. So countries reserve the right to back out of it if they don't want to abide by its terms. And I mean, I guess we'll wait and see.
Okay, and so we have those two questions that were put to the ICJ. I want to remind listeners of the first one. It was, what does international law require countries to do to protect the environment from human-caused climate change? Now that we have the ruling, how did they answer that question?
So the first one, basically the court summarised all those bits of international law covering the climate, as I've just done, such as the Paris Agreement. It reiterated countries have responsibilities under these agreements. And specifically it said, when a country fails to, quote, take appropriate action to protect the climate system from greenhouse gas emissions, it may constitute an internationally wrongful act, which is attributable to that state. When they say state, they mean country. And then there are two clarifications from that point. Again, I mean, I mentioned it's a lot of legalese, and I'm just talking about the summary document, let alone the hundreds of pages of the full decision. So basically, that means that when we talk about greenhouse gas emissions, they're talking about things emitted from producing and consuming fossil fuels like oil. They also said this could be attributed to giving companies licenses to create new fossil fuel projects. And then the second thing they said, which I thought was interesting, was that the court said producing greenhouse gases is not in itself illegal, but failing to keep those emissions below a certain threshold very much is illegal. So again, they're just reiterating, stop doing things that could negatively impact the environment without a counterbalance, given your obligations under these international legal agreements like the Paris Agreement.
So essentially what they're saying in relation to that first question is that countries are indeed legally liable for their contribution to climate change.
Yes, and just outlining a few of the ways that that can be the case. Basically just unlimited greenhouse gas emissions with no limitations. That's illegal and you can be held liable.
And interesting that they're also including the private sector in that. So you're responsible for everything that happens in your country.
That was the most interesting part of this for me, definitely.
And then in terms of the second question, so reminder of what that question was, it said, if countries are found to have caused significant harm to the climate system, negatively impacting small island nations and future generations, what should the consequences be? What was their answer to that?
So they found that countries have a duty to comply with these obligations, and that as part of that duty, they can be asked to pay compensation to other countries that are harmed directly by their failure to prevent excessive emissions. The legal version is that countries can be made to pay if, quote, a sufficiently direct and certain causal nexus can be shown between the wrongful act and injury. So basically saying if you can draw a straight line, cause and effect, let's say, for example, hypothetically, Australia launches a huge gas drilling project and scientists can prove that this project directly causes sea waters to rise around Vanuatu, then Australia would be held legally liable and could pay compensation to Vanuatu for the effects of that project.
Wow.
As a hypothetical.
Yes. So interesting.
Yeah. And they also need to commit to not doing it again, countries that are found guilty of this. And as I said before, countries must regulate the emissions produced by privately owned companies within their countries. So let's say it's not Australia that launches the big gas drilling project, but let's say, again, hypothetically, if Woodside Energy were to launch a new gas drilling project and the same process played out, then Australia could have to pay compensation.
This idea about a duty of care is not new. I feel like over the past 5 years or so, we have heard so much about it.
Yeah.
And it's a topic that's come up here in Australia in our courts.
Yeah. So Australia has kind of wrangled legally with this idea of a duty of care over citizens, which I think is related to this idea of a duty to comply with your obligations under international law. So in fact, last week, the federal court ruled the government does not have a duty of care over two Torres Strait Islander traditional owners, Uncle Pabai Pabai and Uncle Paul Kabai, and also their communities in order to protect them from climate change. In his judgment, Justice Michael Wigney said there are no legal remedies for climate harms caused as a result of high-level policies, which is interestingly kind of one of the things that this ICJ ruling is setting out to address.
Yeah.
Justice Wigney said he was bound by a previous federal court decision in 2022, which had in itself overturned a ruling that found the government had a duty of care to young Australians to consider the long-term impacts of fossil fuel projects. So there was a decision in the young people's favour, and then it was overturned by the federal court, and that overturning is what Justice Wigney said he was bound by when he ruled against the Torres Strait Islander men. But I will be very interested to see what comes from this ICJ ruling if a future case could possibly have more success.
It's so complex when you have different courts kind of finding very different things that actually kind of contradict each other.
Yeah, exactly.
And last question. You mentioned earlier about whether or not this is actually legally enforceable, because it's one thing for it to be, I guess, legally binding, but it's another thing for it to be enforceable.
Yeah.
What does that look like here?
So my understanding is that this ruling by the ICJ was the second thing that they can do. So not a mediation between two states, but to say, we've answered this legal question for you. So this is our opinion. So their decision in and of itself is not, there's not like a law, there's not really a legal precedent in that sense.
I see.
However, what they have said is that countries have a responsibility under existing international laws to not break the rules.
Got it.
So their decision in and of itself is not a legally binding thing, but it has the consequence of holding countries to legally binding obligations.
Got it. So it kind of lays the path down for if a country did want to sue another country for their contribution to climate change, which they say has directly impacted them. Yeah. This decision kind of lays the path for that to now happen.
Yeah. Well, I've not trained as a barrister at the International Court of Justice, but that is my understanding.
Well, you have not trained as a barrister, but you explained that expertly, so you would have fooled me.
Thank
Lucy,
you.
thank you so much.
Thanks, Billi.
And thank you so much for listening to this episode of The Daily Aus. We'll be back this afternoon with your evening headlines, but until then, have a great day.